A nurse I had never met in my life called me on a Tuesday afternoon and told me in a voice trained to stay Jenna.
Even while delivering the worst kind of news that the blood sample I had given to help my dying mother could not possibly belong to her daughter, and that whoever I actually was, I was not who I had spent 32 years believing myself to be. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it, alone in a hospital hallway under fluorescent lights, holding a paper cup of vending machine coffee that had gone cold in my hand, because everything that came after it, the lawyers, the locked filing cabinets, the family that finally had to answer for a decision they made when I was still small enough to fit in a bassinet, all of it started with one phone call I almost didn't answer because I thought it was spam. My name is Maya Ellison. I'm 32 years old, and until that Tuesday, I taught second grade at Fairview Elementary in a town small enough that everyone still waves from their porches, married to my job the way some people are married to a person, content in a life that never asked to be extraordinary. I was raised by Frank and Carol Ellison, a mechanic and a hairdresser who never had much money, but always seemed to have enough love to fill whatever gap the money left behind, and for 32 years I never once doubted that I belonged to them the way a hand belongs to an arm. My mother Carol had been sick for almost a year by then, a slow failing kidney that had turned our family into a quiet rotation of hospital visits and hopeful test results, and when the transplant team asked if I would be tested as a potential living donor, I said yes before they even finished the sentence, because that is simply what you do for the woman who raised you, no hesitation required. The testing took 2 weeks, and I want to be honest that I spent those 2 weeks imagining the surgery itself, the recovery time I'd need to arrange with the school, never once imagining that the results would come back with a problem that had nothing to do with compatibility and everything to do with biology itself. The transplant coordinator, a careful woman named Dr. Patel, asked me to come in for what she called a follow-up conversation, and I remembered the particular stillness of her office, the way she folded her hands before she spoke, because doctors have a specific posture for delivering news that changes a life rather than simply describing one. She told me that the genetic markers in my blood made it biologically impossible for Carol Ellison to be my mother, not a close match that fell short, not a partial mismatch that could be explained by some unusual inheritance pattern, but a complete and total genetic impossibility, the kind of result a lab technician double and triple checks before ever putting it in front of a patient. I sat in that office and asked her, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like my own, whether lab results could simply be wrong, whether samples could be mixed up, and she told me gently that she had already requested a second confirmatory test out of an abundance of caution, and that the second test had come back identical to the first. I drove home that day, not really remembering the drive at all, the way you sometimes arrive somewhere without any memory of the roads that got you there, and I sat in my car in my own driveway for almost an hour before I could make myself walk inside and look at the woman I had called mother for 32 years without the question already sitting behind my eyes. I didn't ask her that night. I want to explain why, because it would have been so simple to simply demand an answer, but Carol was recovering from a procedure that had already exhausted her, and some instinct in me, the same instinct that makes you lower your voice around a sleeping patient, told me this conversation deserved better timing than a Tuesday night when she could barely sit up in bed. Instead, I did what I now understand was the first small act of the entire year that followed. I began quietly gathering information before I ever said a word out loud to anyone, starting with my own birth certificate, which I found in a shoebox in my parents' closet, unremarkable, ordinary, listing Frank and Carol Ellison as my parents at Millbrook General Hospital on a date I had celebrated every year of my life, without ever once questioning it. I called the hospital's records department the following week, using the calm, professional voice I use when I need something from a bureaucracy that doesn't owe me anything, and I asked whether they retained any nursing records or delivery logs from that specific date, and a records clerk named Diane, who would turn out to matter far more than either of us understood in that first conversation, told me that most nursing logs from that era had been digitized, but that a few boxes of original paper records were still stored in an off-site archive because Millbrook General had changed ownership twice since I was born. She told me it could take several weeks to locate anything specific, and I told her I was in no hurry, which was true in the sense that I had waited 32 years without knowing there was even a question to be in a hurry about. While I waited on the hospital archive, I turned my attention closer to home, because a truth this large rarely stays contained inside a single filing cabinet. It usually leaves smaller footprints scattered across a family's ordinary life if you know to look for them. I started noticing things I had spent my whole life not noticing. The way my father Frank sometimes went quiet whenever anyone mentioned the hospital where I was born, the way my mother kept a single photograph from my infancy locked inside a cedar box on her dresser rather than displayed openly the way every other baby photo in our house was framed and hung on the wall. I asked my father directly one evening while we sat on the back porch, the same porch where he taught me to change a car battery when I was 11, whether anything unusual had happened around the time I was born, and I watched him go very still in a way that told me, before he said a single word, that I had just asked the exact right question. He told me that there had been some confusion at the hospital that week, a busy maternity ward, more babies born in a single night than the staff could comfortably manage, and that shortly after they brought me home, a hospital administrator had called asking them to come back in for what was described as a routine follow-up test. My father said that test had led to a private meeting, one my mother had never wanted to discuss again for the rest of her life, and that the hospital had eventually assured them everything was fine, a clerical error resolved, nothing for them to worry about. I asked him plainly whether he believed that explanation, and my father, a man who had spent 32 years never once treating me as anything other than entirely his own daughter, told me quietly that he had chosen to believe it because the alternative had felt unthinkable at the time, a baby they already loved completely, a system telling them not to worry, and a young working-class couple with no resources to fight an institution that held all the paperwork and all the power. That conversation cracked something open that I couldn't close back up again, and I want to be honest that the anger I felt in that moment wasn't directed at my parents at all. It was directed at whatever system, whatever institution, whatever person had decided 32 years ago that a clerical error involving 2 newborn babies didn't rise to the level of something a family deserved the full truth about. The hospital archive search finally produced something 6 weeks later, a call from Diane telling me she had located a partial nursing log from my birth week, water damaged but legible in most places, and when I drove out to the records facility myself to see it in person, I found something that made the entire shape of this story change completely in front of me. The log showed 2 baby girls delivered within 11 hours of each other on the same maternity floor, mine and one other, born to a family whose last name I recognized immediately because it was printed on half the buildings in the county. Prescott, as in Prescott Hotels, as in the family that had built and owned a small regional hospitality empire for 3 generations, the kind of name that shows up on hospital wings and university buildings and charity galas covered by the local paper every single year. I sat in that records office with a photocopy shaking slightly in my hand, understanding for the first time that I had not simply been born into confusion. I had potentially been swapped, at some point during that busy maternity night, with a biological daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the entire region. I did not go looking for the Prescotts immediately. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been so easy to show up at their front gate with a photocopied nursing log and a head full of questions, but something in me, the same nurse's instinct my future story would eventually need, told me that a truth this large required proof before it required confrontation. The same way you don't tell a family their loved one is dying based on a single unclear scan before ordering the test. That actually confirms it. I hired a genetic genealogist, a careful, methodical woman named Renata, who specialized in exactly this kind of case. And together we submitted my DNA to several databases under a research framework rather than a public one, cross-referencing against any Prescott family members who might have also tested, and within 3 months we had our answer, a first cousin match strong enough to make. The picture undeniable. I was, biologically, a Prescott, born the same night as a girl the hospital records showed had gone home with. Frank and Carol Ellison by simple accident of proximity in an overcrowded, understaffed ward. Renata explained to me that hospital baby swaps, while rare, were historically far more common than most people assumed, especially in busy maternity wards before modern electronic ankle tag systems became standard, and that the true tragedy of most swap cases wasn't the initial mistake itself, which was almost always an honest, forgivable human error, but rather what institutions and families sometimes chose to do once they discovered the mistake and had the power to correct it or conceal it. I sat with that sentence for a long time because something about it nagged at the back of my mind, the way my father had described a hospital administrator calling my parents back in for a quote-unquote routine follow-up test shortly after I was born, a detail that suddenly felt less like an isolated clerical hiccup and much more like the early edge of something that had been managed quietly by people with far more resources than a mechanic and a hairdresser ever had. I decided the only way forward was to learn everything I possibly could about the Prescott family before I ever made contact, the same discipline I had learned as a teacher. Managing a classroom of 30 children, you never walk into a difficult situation without first understanding exactly who and what you're dealing with. Richard Prescott, the family patriarch, had run Prescott Hotels for nearly 4 decades, a man well known locally for hospital wings named after him and a scholarship fund bearing his family's name, the kind of civic reputation that made him something close to untouchable in local circles. His daughter, the woman who, according to every piece of evidence I now had, should have been raised by Frank and Carol Ellison instead of me, was named Emily Prescott, 32 years old, exactly like me, a woman who had grown up attending private schools, summering at a family lake house, and was now being groomed, according to several local business articles I found while researching, to eventually take over leadership of the family's hotel empire from her aging father. I found an old Society page photograph of Emily at a charity gala, when she was maybe 6 years old, standing beside Richard Prescott in a small formal dress, and something about her face, the shape of her jaw, the particular set of her eyes, was disorienting in a way I still don't have perfect words for, because I was looking at a stranger who nonetheless looked distantly, uncannily like photographs of myself at that exact same age. It took me another 2 months to work up the nerve to actually reach out, and when I finally did, I didn't call the family directly, I contacted the hospital's current legal compliance department instead, formally requesting a review of birth records from that specific date range, citing the genetic evidence Renata and I had already compiled, because I understood by then that whatever happened next needed to happen through channels that would generate their own paper trail rather than through a private conversation that could later be denied. The hospital's legal department response came back slower than I expected, and carefully worded in the particular way institutions write when they're worried about liability, acknowledging that an internal review from decades earlier had, quote, identified an administrative discrepancy involving 2 patients from that delivery period, and that the matter had been, quote, addressed at the time in consultation with both families involved. I read that sentence more times than I could count, because it meant something I hadn't fully let myself consider until that exact moment. It meant the Prescott family had known, not suspected, not wondered privately the way my own parents had wondered, but known, formally, decades ago, addressed, in the hospital's own careful legal language, in consultation with both families involved, which meant somebody on the Prescott side of this story had sat in a room with hospital administrators at some point in the past and made a decision about what to do with the truth, and that decision had clearly not involved telling either child the actual facts of her own. I called my father again, this time with the hospital's letter in front of me, and asked him directly whether the private meeting he had described all those years ago had involved anyone from the Prescott family, and I watched his face change in a way I will never forget, because he told me, quietly, that yes, there had been another couple in a separate meeting room that same week, and that shortly after that period, an unusual and unexplained arrangement had begun, a modest but steady monthly payment arriving in our families. Account from what the paperwork described only as a private family trust, money my parents had genuinely believed for years was simply an inheritance from a distant relative neither of them had ever met, because that was the explanation they had been given and had no particular reason to question. My mother, when I finally sat down with both of them together and laid out everything I now knew, confirmed the same story with tears in her eyes, telling me she had always felt a strange discomfort about that money but had never once imagined it connected to anything as enormous as what I was now describing, and I watched 32 years of quiet, unexamined gratitude toward a mysterious benefactor curdle instantly into something closer to grief for both of them, what became clear over the following weeks as Renata and I dug deeper into public records, and I began quietly, carefully documenting every single detail the same way I once documented my grandmother's decline. For an entirely different reason, in an entirely different life, was that the Prescott family had discovered the swap not at birth, but years later, when Emily was roughly 17 and undergoing a routine medical procedure that required blood typing, a result that apparently didn't match either parent, and sent Richard Prescott into a private investigation of his own, instead of coming forward publicly at that point when both girls were still teenagers, and any transition, however painful, would have at least been survivable during formative years. Richard Prescott had instead quietly arranged the compliance meeting with the hospital, secured a confidentiality agreement, and begun sending my parents a monthly payment that was never explained as anything other than distant family money, effectively purchasing a permanent silence around a truth that belonged, morally, if not yet legally, to two young women who never got the chance to actually choose anything about it. I found a private investigator's report buried in old family trust paperwork released to me, only because a portion of the trust document had been unsealed as part of the hospital's own compliance review, and reading it felt like reading a story about my own life written entirely by strangers, cold and clinical, a summary of Emily Prescott's biological parentage compared against Frank and Carol Ellison's known medical and financial background, followed by a formal recommendation that, quote, maintaining the current living arrangement presented significantly lower reputational and inheritance risk than pursuing a public correction. Lower reputational and inheritance risk. I sat with that phrase for a very long time, because it meant that somewhere, at some point, a room full of lawyers and a wealthy man protecting a hotel empire had looked at two teenage girls and calculated which arrangement would cost the family less money and less embarrassment, and had chosen silence over truth, comfort over correction, an heir raised inside the family's wealth over a biological daughter who would have arrived at 17 as an unfamiliar stranger with an equal legal claim to everything Richard Prescott had spent his life building. Everything I had learned by then pointed toward one enormous, uncomfortable fact that under the terms of the Prescott family trust, which Renata's contact had helped me quietly access through public probate filings from an earlier family matter, inheritance and succession language specified biological descendants of Richard Prescott by name, meaning that legally, if the truth of the swap were ever formally established, I, not Emily, was the one entitled to eventual succession over Prescott Hotels, a company worth, according to industry publications, somewhere north of $90 million. I want to go back for a moment to the weeks right after Dr. Patel's office, before Renata, before Corinne, before I understood any of the shape this story would eventually take, because those weeks were the hardest ones in ways the later, more dramatic chapters somehow never quite matched. I remember lying awake at 2 In the morning, trying to reconcile 32 years of birthday photographs, school recitals, a father teaching me to change a tire in a gravel driveway, with the cold clinical certainty of a genetic impossibility printed on a lab report, and I remember thinking that grief has a strange shape when the thing you're grieving is a version of your own history you never actually lost because it was never real to begin with. I kept teaching my second graders through all of it, standing in front of a classroom of 7-year-olds practicing their multiplication tables while carrying, quietly, the knowledge that my entire biological identity had been rewritten somewhere in a filing cabinet decades before any of them were born, and there was something strangely steadying about that daily routine, the predictable rhythm of chalk and small voices that kept me from unraveling completely. During the months the investigation stretched on, Renata used to remind me, whenever the waiting felt unbearable, that genealogical cases like mine rarely moved quickly, precisely because the truth they uncovered tended to be enormous, and that rushing toward a confrontation before the evidence was fully assembled almost always ended badly for the person seeking the truth rather than for the family that had spent years protecting a secret with considerably more resources than I had. Corinne echoed that same patience once she joined the case, telling me during our very first meeting that the Prescott family's lawyers would look for any gap in my documentation the way a structural engineer looks for a hairline crack, and that our entire strategy depended on making sure there wasn't a single loose thread anywhere in the story once we finally told it publicly. I think about my father, Frank, often from that period too, the way he sat with me one evening on the porch, long after our first conversation about the hospital, and told me quietly that he had always wondered, in some small, unspoken corner of himself, whether the money arriving every month had something to do with the strange meeting the hospital had called them into all those years ago, but that he had chosen, deliberately, not to ask too many questions because he was terrified that pulling on that thread might somehow cost him the daughter he already loved completely. That admission broke something open in me gently rather than painfully, because it meant my father's silence hadn't been indifference at all. It had been fear, the particular fear of a man with very little power trying to protect the one thing in his life he refused to risk losing, an understanding that made it impossible for me to ever be truly angry with him, even on the hardest nights. I decided, with Renata's help, and eventually the help of an attorney named Corinne Aldridge, who specialized in exactly this kind of complex family, an inheritance litigation, that the goal was never going to be seizing an empire I had no genuine attachment to. The goal was simply, finally, making sure the truth existed somewhere official, on paper, in a way that could never again be quietly managed by a family with enough money to make an inconvenient fact disappear for another 32 years. Corinne warned me early on that a family with Richard Prescott's resources would almost certainly try to control the narrative the moment they learned I had assembled a formal case, and she suggested we time any public disclosure carefully, ideally at a moment when the Prescott family itself was already gathered publicly with witnesses rather than in a private meeting where the story could simply be denied, buried, or spun before I ever had a chance to speak it plainly myself. That opportunity arrived faster than I expected when a local business journal announced that Prescott Hotels would be celebrating its 40th anniversary with a gala event at their flagship downtown property, an evening explicitly built, according to the announcement, around formally introducing Emily Prescott to the region's business community as the company's incoming heir apparent, a public passing of the torch designed, I now understood, to permanently and publicly seal exactly the version of the family story that Richard Prescott had spent 17 years quietly protecting. Corinne and I spent the weeks leading up to that gala preparing carefully, gathering the confirmed genetic testing results, the unsealed portions of the hospital compliance review, the trust succession language, and the private investigators' report with its damning phrase about reputational risk, organizing everything into a single clean presentation that could stand entirely on its own without requiring anyone in that room to simply take my word for anything. I did not plan to attend uninvited or to force my way into a private family celebration, and I want to be honest that some part of me still hesitated even then, wondering whether disrupting an entire family's carefully built story was truly worth the cost to everyone involved, including Emily, a woman who had never once asked to be raised inside a lie any more than I had asked to be raised outside of one. It was Emily herself, strangely enough, who made the final decision for me when a mutual contact through the hospital records process quietly informed her attorney that questions were being raised about the family's succession documentation, and Emily, to her considerable credit, reached out to me directly through Corinne rather than hiding behind her father's legal team, asking simply, in a short message, whether what she had heard could possibly be true. We spoke on the phone for nearly 2 hours that night, two women who shared an entire biological history neither of us had ever known existed, and Emily told me something that stayed with me through everything that followed, that she had always felt a strange, persistent distance from her father growing up, a sense that she was being managed rather than loved, without ever being able to name why, and that some quiet part of her had always wondered if there was a piece of her own story she simply hadn't been told. She asked me, near the end of that call, whether I would come to the anniversary gala, not to ambush anyone, but because she said she deserved to hear the truth in the same room as her father, with the same documentation at the same time, rather than secondhand through lawyers who might soften or reshape it before it ever reached her. I agreed, and Corinne and I spent the final week before the event preparing exactly the way I once prepared for an entirely different family's reckoning, calm, methodical, every document in order, nothing left to chance. Nothing dependent on anyone believing me simply because I said it out loud with enough conviction. The night of the gala, the Prescott flagship hotel ballroom was lit with warm gold light, 300 guests in formal wear, a jazz quartet playing near the entrance, an enormous banner reading 40 Years of Excellence hanging above a stage where Richard Prescott would soon stand to introduce his daughter as the future of everything he had built. I arrived quietly, Corinne beside me carrying a slim leather folder, and found Emily waiting near a side entrance exactly where she said she would be, her face pale but steady, and she squeezed my hand once before we walked in together, two women who looked, once you knew to look, unmistakably like sisters standing side by side for the very first time in either of our lives. Richard Prescott took the stage as the evening reached its planned climax, thanking the region's business community for 40 years of partnership, thanking his late wife's memory for her early support of the company, and then turning toward Emily with practiced warmth, announcing that after decades of building Prescott hotels from a single regional property into the empire it had become, he was proud to formally name his daughter Emily as the company's next chief executive, effective immediately, a natural, deserving continuation of everything the Prescott name represented. The room applauded warmly, glasses raised, and I watched Richard Prescott's face carry the particular satisfied certainty of a man who believed completely that the story he had spent 17 years quietly managing was finally, permanently sealed in front of exactly the audience he needed to seal it in front of. When the applause settled, Emily did something her father clearly had not planned for. She stepped toward the podium herself, thanked him for the honor, and then said, in a clear, steady voice that carried easily across the ballroom, that before accepting anything, there was something the room deserved to. No, something she herself had only learned in the past several weeks, and that she wanted her sister to be the one to explain it properly. I want you to picture Richard Prescott's face in that exact moment, the word sister landing in a ballroom full of the region's most influential business leaders, his practiced composure cracking for the first time in longer than I imagine he could remember. Because whatever he had spent 17 years, and who knows how much money quietly managing, had just walked onto his own stage, invited there by his own daughter, in front of every witness he could possibly need. I walked up beside Emily with Corinne's folder in my hands, and I did not raise my voice because I had learned by then, the same way I would learn again in an entirely different family story, that the calmest voice in a room usually carries the furthest when it's carrying something true. I told the room plainly that 32 years ago, on the same night in the same maternity ward, two baby girls had been switched, and that the Prescott family had discovered this mistake not decades ago as an innocent, unrecoverable accident, but 17 years ago when Emily was still a teenager, at a point when the truth could still have been handled with care and honesty, and that instead of coming forward, the family had chosen a documented, quietly funded arrangement of silence, purchasing my parents' cooperation with an unexplained monthly payment for 17 years rather than ever telling either daughter the actual shape of her own life. I laid the documents on a side table, one at a time, the unsealed compliance letter acknowledging the discrepancy, the private investigator's report with its cold calculation of reputational and inheritance risk, the trust succession language naming biological descendants specifically, and finally the genetic testing results Renata had helped me compile, confirmed twice, independently verified, undeniable in the particular boring, exhaustive way that real evidence always ends up being undeniable. Richard Prescott tried, briefly, to recover the room the way powerful men often do, saying this was a private family matter being aired inappropriately in a business setting, and I told him calmly that I agreed it should have remained private 17 years ago when he first had the chance to handle it honestly instead of quietly managing it for the rest of both our lives. A murmur moved through the crowd, board members glancing at each other, a woman near the front already quietly stepping outside with her phone pressed to her ear, and I watched the way I imagine you watch a structure finally give way after years of stress. Fractures no one wanted to acknowledge, as the version of Richard Prescott's story that had stood unquestioned for 4 decades simply could not hold its own weight any longer once the actual paperwork was sitting in front of 300 witnesses instead of locked in a private filing cabinet. Emily stood beside me through all of it, not flinching, not stepping back toward her father's side of the stage. And when a reporter near the front asked whether she intended to still accept the company's leadership under these revelations, she said, steadily, that she intended to make sure whatever came next was decided honestly by both daughters rather than quietly by one father alone, a sentence that told everyone in that room exactly which version of the Prescott family story she had chosen to belong to. In the weeks that followed, the fallout moved in directions I genuinely hadn't fully anticipated. The hospital's parent healthcare network launched its own formal investigation into how a documented discrepancy had gone uncorrected for 17 years. Prescott Hotel's board initiated an independent review of the trust succession dispute, and Richard Prescott, faced with mounting legal and reputational consequences, eventually agreed to a mediated settlement rather than risk a public trial that would have kept the story in every regional paper for months. I did not ask to take over Prescott Hotels, and I want to be honest that the idea never once genuinely appealed to me, because I had spent 32 years building a life around a classroom of second graders and a mechanic and a hairdresser who loved me completely long before any of us knew what the word biological even meant in this story, and no amount of money was going to replace the family I already had. What I asked for instead, through the eventual settlement, was full public acknowledgement of the original swap, a formal correction to both birth records and a portion of the trust structured specifically to ensure Frank and Carol Ellison, who had raised a child that was never biologically theirs with the exact same devotion they would have given their own, were financially secure for whatever years they had left, a decision that felt less like justice and more like simply making sure love finally got properly credited for everything it had quietly carried for 32 years. Emily and I speak regularly now, an odd, tender kind of relationship neither of us had any blueprint for, 2 women who share a face and a birthday and absolutely no childhood memories at all, slowly building something new out of the wreckage of 2 families' worth of secrets. She eventually did take over leadership of Prescott Hotels, but only after establishing, publicly and formally, a scholarship fund in both our names for children navigating foster care and family displacement. A decision she told me privately felt like the only way to make something honest grow out of soil that had been poisoned by silence for so long. Richard Prescott and I have spoken exactly once since that night. A brief, careful phone call in which he offered something between an apology and a justification, telling me he had only ever been trying to protect his family, and I told him, as gently and as plainly as I could, that protecting a family and protecting a secret are almost never actually the same thing, no matter how much money or how many lawyers you use to convince yourself otherwise. My mother Carol received her transplant eventually from an anonymous donor match found through the same registry that had started this entire story, and I sat beside her hospital bed holding the hand of the only mother I have ever truly known, thinking about how strange it was that the search for a biological match had ended up teaching me, more than anything else, that biology was never actually the thing that made her my mother in the first place. I think, now, about that phone call from a nurse I never met. The cold vending machine coffee, the particular stillness of Dr. Patel's office, and I understand that the actual gift buried inside that terrible Tuesday afternoon was never the discovery of who I biologically was. It was the discovery of exactly how much love the people who raised me had chosen, deliberately, every single day for 32 years, without a single strand of DNA ever obligating them to choose it at all.